Finally, after a long, tiring, stressful, and busy end of the semester, I am done with my first year of college. I am back home in my workshop, and in front of the camera is the first subject. Here is a Dell Dimension E520. My father picked this up at the recycle yard about a month ago. He was about to leave, and some other guy showed up and was recycling this computer. It used to belong to his daughter. She's since upgraded to a newer computer or a laptop, I'm not sure. But they no longer needed this machine, and they were going to just recycle it. My dad picked it up, brought it home. There's a few other goodies, so those will be coming up in later vids. But I have turned this on, and it appears this guy and his daughter did the wrong thing when recycling a computer. Not only does it still have the operating system on it, as in they didn't wipe the disk, it also still has the daughter's account on it, complete with everything. It appears to be about 6 years of her life, school projects, pictures, you name it. It's all there. They did not do anything to hide that. There's not even a password on it. It booted into her account as soon as I fired it up and Windows XP started. So I will be correcting that to make sure her account is properly closed down. I am going to keep the disk because I've needed just a general hard drive for testing various computers. I have a small pile of them in the other room. Those will be, again, showing up in later vids. But, yeah, kind of a unsafe move on their part. But, for now, this is going to be a look inside, a little bit of a cleanup, and just overall inspection of this computer. Pretty standard hardware in this machine. 320GB Western Digital hard drive, SATA connection. It's got a DVD burner, which goes along with on the top it's labeled as a Media Center edition of Windows XP, so that sort of fits along with that. Got standard 4 RAM slots, 2 modules installed, 1 gig each, so 2GB of RAM total. I believe it's DDR2. I'll again be looking into that a bit later. Intel chipset, as to be expected. It's got the largest shroud that would be fitted on these machines. It's got the holes where the heat pipes would stick out, but it has what looks like the next size down in heatsink, and I'll have to go into that a bit later. Down here, it's got a couple PCIe slots, one of which has the clip meant for holding a large card, like a graphics card. Also, at the bottom has some legacy PCI slots, both of which are populated. The bottom slot there is a dial-up modem, and in the slot above it there is a Wi-Fi card, so this can actually connect to a Wi-Fi network. Up here there is a Dell branded power supply, and I should probably give you a closer look, as at first this confused me a bit. Here's a close-up of the label on the Dell branded power supply. Got 9 amps at 100 to 120, 4.5 amps at 200 to 240, signifies passive power factor correction. Output, 22 amps at 5 volts, a pair of 12 volt rails, 18 amps each, 1 amp at negative 12, only 17 at 3.3 volts, because it's a newer system, makes less use of the 3.3 rail, and 2 amps at 5 volt standby. So, 305 watts max, that seems pretty normal. What originally threw me off about this power supply and its wiring harness was that it had white wires here instead of the usual yellow wires. So, that confused me for a sec. I've worked on a few older Dell machines that used a proprietary pinout to the motherboard, so you could only use a Dell power supply as a replacement. A standard ATX would have the wrong pinout. I'm not sure if the actual plug would fit. If it did, it would probably blow up the motherboard because it would be the wrong voltages in the wrong places. But this looked like a standard 24-pin ATX connector. When I looked up the ATX pinout, this checked out. White wire is 12 volts. Over here on the CPU connector, this is using yellow for the 12 volt. So that makes me think this is just using one of its two 12 volt rails dedicated for the CPU and also for the floppy drive here, but There's no floppy drive installed, and floppy drives aren't that power hungry, so it doesn't matter. CPU gets its own rail, motherboard gets a white rail, the hard drive just off screen here gets the white rail, as does the DVD burner. So that's how they did it, but this had me a little bit confused at first, worried that I wouldn't be able to upgrade or replace the supply. Here is the heatsink and the heatsink shroud. Up at the front is standard on these machines. It has a large, I think 120mm, maybe a bit larger fan. It's the only intake fan on the computer. Sucks in air through the front, blows across the heatsink. The air then circulates around the rest of the case and is ejected out the vents in the back and the power supply's exhaust fan. So that's okay. But here comes the need for me to rant a little bit. Dell seems to use this single size of shroud for nearly every processor in this line of computers and similar computers of the same era. This means that when they use a heatsink that is smaller, like here, there's a large gap between the heatsink and the walls of the shroud, giving a straight shot through to the fan. A heatsink has very closely spaced fins, and because of this, it provides a relatively restricted airflow path. In order to force air to flow in between the fins and make use of its surface area, there needs to be a significant pressure between the fan side and the exit side of the heatsink. However, when there's a large gap here, most of the air will follow the path of least resistance and bypass the heatsink entirely, not really going through the fins. Therefore, despite this large heatsink, this computer actually has very reduced, if not totally inadequate, cooling. That concludes my video on the hardware overview and cooling system, or lack thereof, on this computer. In the next video, which should be uploaded soon after this one, there will be the fun of taking the shroud and the heatsink off, replacing the thermal compound, and then some fun airflow experimentation, seeing if I can get this thing to have better cooling performance. Because in the home this computer will go to when I'm done with it, most likely, it would not survive very long because it would be running at nearly full throttle for extended periods of time. So, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.